What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my tutorial on how to paint Marvel Crisis Protocol's Enchantress. I've got the list of paints and colors I've used on this miniature, so if you want to pause the video, note down any colors that you want to use, and then we can dive right on into the tutorial. So for my Enchantress model, I've chosen to sub-assembly into three components. I have the base energy. I have the base itself, which I've already painted. This was a spare I had. I was testing a print and I really liked how it turned out, so I'll be reusing it for my Enchantress. This means I won't have to paint it for this model. And then I've got the Enchantress figure blue tacked to a sub-assembly, which is just a plastic card tube or rod glued to a small 28mm base. The model would be finicky to hold and grip onto, otherwise I'd be risking paint rubbing off, getting fingerprint oils and stuff. It's useful to be able to do this to paint the majority of the model. I do recognize that, especially on the small of her back and then underneath her boot, I will have to repaint those once I attach the model to the energy. I tried to put it in areas where I could hide it, so the back underneath the cape is fairly well hidden, not really well seen, and then the majority of the boot is actually the contact point for where she meets the energy, so hopefully not a lot of repainting there. In terms of gap filling, just really the seams on the sides of the torso, because as always they are two halves. You want to make sure that you use some Vallejo surface putty or milliput and just fill in those gaps, those seams, and make it all smooth. From there, we'll prime the model with Vallejo Surface Primer Black, and then just dive right on in. So the first airbrush base coat step I'm going to do is a mix of fluorescent magenta and fuchsia from AK and scale 75. I made the mistake of trying to do this on pure black primer. I think in retrospect, doing it on a gray or a brighter base coat or primer would have been more ideal. You can see that it's super watery. I didn't dilute the paint too much, but the fluorescent magenta in particular is very dilute out of the bottle, which made airbrushing this as a base coat require a lot of coats. I'm also going to apply a base coat of AK's Dark Sea Blue on Enchantress herself. I just want to cover all of the model, in particular any areas that are going to be green. And then I'll follow that up with a highlight of AK's Dark Green. This is essentially a zenithal two-tone highlight, so I'm targeting the raised areas on the green parts of the suit, particularly on the front of her chest piece, the leggings, and then I want to make sure that I get a sort of top-down highlight of bright to dark on the back of the cape. I'm also going to go with some Scale Colors Bloodfest Crimson, and I'm going to do a undershade onto the fuchsia element. So I'm just taking a diluted mix of this color and targeting the underside of the energy, doing some light passes to essentially pre-shade the fuchsia. I could have base coated with this color, but it's also fairly dilute out of the bottle, so, I mean, either way. From there, I'm going to go back in with a 50-50 mix of fuchsia and magenta, and I'm going to apply a base coat back onto the energy elements. This is largely to correct any oversprays from that crimson undershade. From there, I'll start mixing in progressive amounts of pale yellow. And I'm going to be honest, the energy elements, I think, in retrospect, was kind of muddy in terms of detailing. I had an idea for how I wanted to approach this in terms of the detailing, getting the swirls in, but I think being an older model, it made sort of picking out those highlight elements kind of difficult. They aren't really crisp, they kind of merge and blend together, and there's a lot of flat areas that aren't quite flat but have like subtle raised elements, and the swirls aren't really swirls, they're sort of just potato smudges or like plasticine tubing things. I don't know how to really explain it beyond the fact that it was very difficult to highlight and paint and sort of pick into fine shapes. It wasn't very easy to freehand because there was detailing there. So if I wanted to freehand some swirls or other sort of detailing, I would find myself struggling and fighting with the sculpt itself. So I ended up just highlighting some of the raised edges, in particular on the front, and then trying to create a sort of wavy, almost water-like pattern, but in pink instead of blue. I'm not super happy with how the energy turned out, but I did my best with the sculpt. So here you can see what I ended up with all the highlighting done. I picked out the areas I could and then just focused on the top raised areas and edges. From there, I'm going to go in with that 50-50 mix for the base coat. And with a heavily diluted mix, I'm going to start glazing in. You can do this with the airbrush. You can do this by hand. The goal is to target the midtones in particular, to smooth out some of the roughness and create a more gradual transition from the highlights to the shades and sort of knock back the harshness of some of the freehand edge highlighting. I'm also going to use Games Workshop's Volupus Pink and targeting the midtones and then in particular the shadow tones. I want to deepen this color, add a bit more contrast and a bit more vibrancy. I found that the fluorescent magenta and the fuchsia was looking a little bit flat in the shadows, so I found that the contrast pink helped to add that deep vibrancy that I wanted. I'm going to go in with some dark green and I'm going to rebase coat on the suit. You're going to find when you're airbrushing that sometimes the finish isn't the same as if you were to apply a base coat by hand. So I'm just using dark green, go back in over the highlights and make sure that I'm getting a nice even base coat of that green color. From there, I'm going to do my first highlight of deep green, and I'm going to largely ignore the fine folds. I'm targeting the more broader highlight elements, and with paint diluted, you can sort of feather and fade out the colors as you apply them. So you can see here that as I'm applying the highlight, I'm fading out to create a softer blend. So I'm not having to mix all of the individual steps. I'm just going through each of the progressive layers of colors. Light green is my next highlight. I'm going to be targeting more of the edges on the, I guess the leather straps of our waistband. And then as I'm highlighting some of the more individual finer folds, you can see I'm picking out some of the wrinkles in the suit. I'm going to do my best not to get the paint into the seams in between the different elements. But if the paint does, it's not a big deal. I'm going to go back in at a later step and redefine those seams afterwards. I want to make sure that my highlights go across and are unified over the entire surface. I'm going to go with spring green next, and I'm going to continue brightening the suit. With this color, I'm really targeting her bodice, her corset. So we're looking at her breasts, her abs, and then the leather on the waistband in particular. Because there's so much green on the model, we want to try and adjust the values of what we're painting to help create a bit of a material or segment separation in between the piece. So I went fairly bright on the corset and on the leather straps. The gloves and the leggings are a little bit darker in terms of value. So with the 50-50 mix of the dark green and dark sea blue, I'm just going to, with a diluted mixture of the paint, go back in and paint back the seam lines of the suit. And then once that's dry, I'll go in with some various highlights of the greens and touch up the edge. Much like with the fuchsia, I'm going to go in with a 50-50 mix of that dark green and dark sea blue. And I'm just going to use the airbrush to glaze in the midtones and shadow tones of the green. You can do this by hand as well. I just find it easier with the airbrush, in particular when you're targeting the microfolds. It's a lot easier just to use the airbrush, apply this glaze consistently, and then go back in by hand and fine tune any oversprays or highlights you want to bring back. So I'm just doing some soft sprays and then using the airbrush to air dry each layer before doing the next. Base coat the non-metal gold. I'm going to use Vallejo's Burnt Umber and apply a nice even base coat over all the gold elements. We're looking at the rings on her leggings, we're looking at the belt, and then we're looking at her tiara. I can be a little bit messy around the hair, but when you're painting the belt and the rings, be careful not to overpaint onto the green. The next highlight is Vallejo's English uniform. We're just going to go straight into the next color. I'm going to be careful when I'm painting the rings to start thinking about how the rings overlap and leaving some of that burnt umber in the deepest recesses. My next highlight is Japanese Uniform World War One, and we're going to target the raised edges on the belt, the top of the diamond, and then where we start to get into the shadows, I'm going to do more of an edge highlight as opposed to doing a blend, I guess, just to get the sharp, bright and dark contrast to really sell the non-metal effect. And then on the rings, you want to be careful to not overpaint into where the rings overlap. You want to start highlighting to create that sort of layered effect on the gold. My next highlight, I'll start mixing in progressive amounts of pale yellow. And the goal here is to work from pure Japanese uniform into pure pale yellow. So you'll want to mix a couple of steps and layer up your colors. You can do a bit of glazing, you can do a bit of feathering. You can do wet blending if you want, whatever technique is comfortable for you. The goal is to work up to pure pale yellow for the highlight. As always with non-monometal, the goal is to get sharp contrast between your bright brights and your dark darks, and you want them side by side. So try and apply your highlights in a way that you're picking out the edges, and then you're getting a nice deep shadow right beside your brightest highlights. For my final highlight, I'm going to go in with pure pastel yellow. And I'm not going to highlight all of the raised edges, but I'm going to pick out the areas where I want the sharpest sort of spots or pings and do a sharp highlight there. You can see that on the belt. I'm doing a sharp highlight on the top of the V, a bit of a shade as it dips down. And then on the bottoms, I'm doing some bright dots for specular highlighting. Finally, I'm going with some Scale Colors Inktense Wood. And I'm going to do a glaze into the shadow tones. This will add a bit of a deeper orangey brown color into the shadows. Where I glaze in the midtones, it'll help to create a softer transition. And then in the deeper shadows, it'll just add that little bit of extra punch and vibrancy. When you're doing the rings, I'm targeting specifically the areas of overlap to help deepen and reinforce that overlapping effect. Base coat the skin, I'm doing a base coat of Base Flush from AK, being careful not to overpaint into the green and keeping that dark sea blue in the recesses to help blackline the separate elements. For our highlighting, we're going to go from Base Flush into Beige Red. You can mix up a couple of steps, or if you're more comfortable with wet blending or glazing, you can use that technique as well. Really, we want to get a nice solid midtone of the Beige Red, leaving Base Flush only in the deepest shadows, so around the eyes, the nose, the armpits. From pure Beige Red, I'm going to start mixing in progressive amounts of pastel yellow. And I know on this sculpt, the musculature isn't super defined, but I am going to try and pick out certain key muscles I think would have a little bit more definition. So we're looking at like her deltoid, where it meets the collarbone and the pectoral. We're going to be looking at her cheekbones and nose in particular, getting some sharpness there, some brightness in the highlighting. And then in particular on the breasts as well, I want to make sure that I get a highlight down the middle in between the breasts and then on the tops as well. I'm going to use some Scarlet Red from Vallejo Game Air, and I'm going to do a bit of shading and nuancing on the skin. And I do apologize for the camera angle. I know that the airbrush does cover a lot of it, so I apologize for that. But basically what I'm doing is, with a diluted mix and low PSI, I'm doing some glazing with the airbrush to target those mid and shadow tones, add a bit of rosiness, and then with a damp brush, a damp clean brush, cleaning up the overspray before it dries. I don't want any of that speckling or overspraying onto the highlighted areas. I'm going to use some Tenebrous Gray, and I'm going to black line the eye socket. So with a fine detail brush, I'm just painting in Tenebrous Gray to fill in the sockets. From there, I'll use white sands, and I'm going to paint the dot of the eye, being careful to leave a ring of the Tenebrous Gray to outline the eye itself. And then I'll go back in with some diluted Tenebrous Gray, and I'll paint the dot of the pupil. base coat the hair, I'm using French Brown from AK. I'm going to apply a nice even base coat. It'll take a few passes. I just want to be careful not to overpaint any of the green, the skin, or the gold. From there, I'll do a 50-50 mix of French Brown and Sahara Yellow for the highlighting of the skin. Now, I'm going to largely ignore individual strands. With this highlight, I'm targeting the main forms and the main volumes of the hair. From there, I'll go with pure Sahara Yellow, and I'll start to highlight the individual strands. And here is where we start to really add the definition. You can see that as I apply more and more of this Sahara Yellow, I'm starting to pick up more of those individual strands, particularly in the front and the main fold of the hair. I've got the paint nice and diluted so I can build up progressive layers of the color. And that gives me a little bit more variation without having to mix any color mixes for the hair. Next highlight, I'll start mixing in progressive amounts of pale yellow. And with this one, I'm going to target the front of the hair and some of the more raised hair strands, I guess, of the hair form itself. I don't want to over highlight all of the hair strands, just the main ones in the front to add or to accentuate the volume of the hair. If you over highlight every individual strand, you actually end up flattening it. So you want to be very selective with this highlighting step. Finally, I'm going to go in with some Games Workshop's Druchii Violet, and I'm going to apply a undershade over the entire model. So I'm targeting the deep shadows, add a bit of extra nuance. Something I do on all my Marvel models is use some common elements to unify the entire collection. So using this Druchii Violet in the shading helps to create this sort of common environment or this common color that is present in all of my collection. So even though every model has its own unique color scheme or color palette, I still have certain colors and certain details that are all the same in all my models to help unify the entire thing as one holistic collection. And that's the completed model. Once the base is done, once everything's done, use super glue, assemble everything together, and then because this is a gaming piece, I do use a matte varnish. So Mr. Hobby's Super Clear is my varnish of choice. I seal the entire miniature, gives a nice protection for gaming piece and for handling, and our Enchantress is complete. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.